And I'm joined by our amazing speakers today. We have Kat Coletta, who is a senior product designer and design for design systems at ADT, who also works with Patrick Tunga-Lurgo, who is a lead design system designer, and Adekunle Oduye joins us as a UX engineer. I'm Michelle Chin, a design advocate at Zero Height. And let's get started. So, I figured we can kick things off with a little bit of introductions. Um, so, I feel it would be great if you could tell us a little bit about your personal design system experience, what you currently do, and maybe a quick fun fact. Uh, Kat, would you like to start?
Sure. Hi, I'm Kat, and I'm a design system designer at ADT. I started my journey with design systems in 2017 when I joined Realtor.com. And funny thing that my first day as a design system designer, I found myself Googling what is design system. So everything was completely new to me. And we were starting design system from scratch. So the whole team, we learned all together how to do that, how to um, create components, how to structure design system team. Then a couple of years later, I joined T-Mobile, design system team at T-Mobile, and I was focusing on iOS and Android applications. And also over there, I learned system of systems and how actually complex design systems could be. And right now, I'm working together with Patrick at ADT on design system called Nebula.
Perfect. Adekunle?
Yeah. Hey everyone, my name is Adekunle Oduye. I've been doing design systems for the past 10 years. Currently, I am on sabbatical, but most recently, I was a design engineer, tech lead at Plaid. I worked in design systems in all forms as a product designer, engineer, and whatnot. Um, and yeah, a little fun fact about me: I'm an avid traveler, and I've been to over 40 countries, and I'm trying to increase that by 10 by the end of the year. So yeah.
Nice. And Patrick?
Yeah, hey everyone. Patrick Tungalergo, lead design systems designer at ADT. I feel as if I've had many past lives for my career. I used to be a soccer player, then from there that led to me being a music journalist, and then a software developer to now a designer. And I like this life a lot more than my previous ones. I was doing a lot of development work. Started at like a marketing agency right after I got my degree in web design development from an art institute. Prior to that, I studied computer engineering, and I think I didn't know what design systems stuff really was. I was just following a lot of. I think a lot of developers, engineers would know the whole concept of dry, like don't repeat yourself. So I found myself just kind of making a component library, and so I could just reuse it and share it with my friends, my coworkers, colleagues, and then that just took on a life of its own as the company I was working for didn't have a discipline that was that intermediary between designers and developers. So I found myself playing that role and playing that role really well and really enjoying it a lot until I learned that there was something called like a UX engineer. And from then just started learning about design systems and systems thinking, and I just didn't turn back ever since. Just started to hit the ground running and fully transition from a developer to more of a design focused person. And I think a lot of my experience as a engineer and developer has helped me uh, uh, work really well in this new landscape as a designer.
For sure. I definitely wish I had engineering skills to level up my design prowess. And I was wondering if you could all share with the audience a little bit about your design system team as well as the design system evolution at either ADT or Adekunle at your most recent experience at Plaid or other places. Um, Adekunle, would you like to go first?
Yeah, for sure. So I was at Plaid for 2 years, and the team has varying sizes, but I would say like in its height, we had 2 design engineers, 1 design technologist, 2 designers, and then we all reported to a design manager. So that was kind of the structure of the team. And to kind of the differentiate between like design technologists and UX engineers, design technologists mostly focusing on prototyping and tooling. So anything that's like Figma related plugins or anything like that, that was like kind of like the design technologist role. And then for the UX engineers, we were focusing on just kind of making sure that our components are scalable, accessible, and performant. So that was kind of like the setup of my team.
Cool. Thank you for that. And Kat and Patrick, what about ADT?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Tell us a little bit about like the design system team makeup and kind of like the design system evolution.
Yeah, I mean, kind of looking at it, it's really just Kat and I. Just to give you guys some context, ADT's design team. We're relatively young. We're maybe probably like 4 or 5 years old. So ADT is still growing in design discipline and design thinking. Um, and since the introduction of Nebula, the ADT design system that drives their flagship app ADT Plus, Kat and I, we work with, we more so handle the design system as a democratic approach where we have representatives from different platforms because we have to represent web platforms, iOS as well as Android. So there are dedicated engineers to handle the design system on the code side of things, uh, apart from just general designers and general engineers. However, our design team, what I love about our design team, we work really well together. So there's times where if Kat and I are creating like a new component that needs to be added to the system, we have no qualms about asking for like feedback or having other designers drive the initial designs, and then we just go through the whole design iteration process.
Perfect. That sounds really good. I love the ability to get contributions. All right, let's jump into some design token conversations and topics. So let me share my screen really quick. So in our How We Document report, we asked what people are or what teams are making tokens for, and the popular one seems to be colors. People are allowed to select more than one answer. So the top 3: colors, typography, spacing. And I would love to get a sense for, you know, what elements seem to be the trickiest to create tokens for, and did anything surprise you about creating tokens for any of these elements? Kat, do you have any thoughts?
Sure. Yeah. So in our use case, it's exactly what is described here. We started our token organizations with colors, and previously we already had some token system, but it didn't allow to scale. It was inconsistent naming. So around a year ago, we decided, okay, so let's rethink it, let's restructure. So, and we started from colors. And I think starting your token system from colors, it could be bad and good at the same time. Why? Because usually design systems products have huge variety of colors, right? So it's some of them used for specific UI elements, some of them used only, let's say, in illustrations. So there are lots of use cases, there are lots of complexity compared to spacing, where you will have 10 to 12 values. So that's why I think starting your tokens with colors could be a little bit complex. But the advantages of starting with colors, it's actually the same. So it forces you to just think about all of those use cases, think about the naming convention, think about the levels of tokens like globals, aliases. So, and that it's very easy to just apply to other elements. So I think what I'm trying to say here that you could start your token organization, token structure from like basic tokens, like spacing, like corners, and later progressed to more complex. And I think this is what I would recommend if teams just starting with tokens, because it could prevent you from being overwhelmed with all those colors use cases. And yeah, so I would say it's start from smaller tokens.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I think everyone thinks about colors first as an easy start, but that definitely brings up a lot of yeah, you brought up a lot of good points around that. Adekunle, do you have anything to add from your experience?
Yeah, I plus one to what Kat said. I think with colors, it's probably the most difficult when kind of trying to convert them to tokens, because there's so many different variations and color modes, and you got different color schemes and whatnot. So I think it's very important to kind of like make sure you have a clear, concise naming convention, because it can make or break your design system. And I've been part of a couple of design systems where the token names are not predictable, and there's like clashes and whatnot, and it made it very hard to kind of build components that were supported for light and dark mode. So I definitely agree that you definitely have your base tokens, and always when you're like building, you always want to not use them directly and use like the alias tokens, because those are kind of the ones that are more flexible and whatnot. And last but not least, we have like the component specific tokens, which you should use sparingly, because the idea is like if the more specific you get with tokens, the harder it is to kind of overwrite and kind of be able to be flexible for different color modes and whatnot. So 100% agree. I think you definitely should make sure that like the naming convention is predictable and scalable. Because I've seen some token names that are like 13 words long, and I was like, yeah, no one's gonna understand what that does. So that would be my piece of advice for everyone.
Yeah, that is really great advice. And I think the more that I'm talking to teams around design tokens, they are often kind of restarting and iterating pretty frequently. I think a lot of times teams feel the pressure to create tokens and have it be perfect the first time because they are so foundational. But I think it sounds like in everyone's experience, there is a good bit of iteration. All right. Um, so when we talk about the number of token types used in a design system, so it's kind of based on what they're tokenizing in the previous question. I guess it seems like 6 elements seems like what is the most popular. If a team is just starting out or looking to expand, what advice do you have for them? Adekunle, do you have any thoughts?
Just to clarify, like when we say token types, what does that mean?
So, yeah, I guess like not like alias and component, but like aspects of tokening, like colors, typography, space, that type of thing.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. Yeah, I think 6 is kind of like, I agree with like 6, because I think there's a lot of cases where, or no. So I kind of, if I'm starting out, I always try to make sure that like uh, I keep it simple, and I think I kind of follow the rule of 3. And usually, like for tokens, it's like color, spacing, and typography. And I think for me, I feel like that's like probably like 60% of a lot of the usage of tokens. Um, and then obviously as you grow, you might need more, but I feel like in the baseline, if you're just starting a system with like one product, 3 is probably best. And then obviously if you start building more components and supporting more systems and whatnot, I think that's definitely going to evolve. But I say like no more than like 12, because I think any more than that will make the system pretty brittle from my perspective.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I love the idea of the rule of 3 as a great starting point. Kat, what about your experience from working at ADT?
I would say that before expanding tokens, it would be good to evaluate if they've been used. So if you have even like one element tokenized, so first make sure like designers, engineers are using them. So ensuring they're easy to use, ensuring that the format you're handing off to developers, it's actually working for them, so that it's easy to translate to different platforms. You could also try to see if you have positive impact on your final product. Like, let's say you tokenize spacing. So in a new feature in the final product, you see that spacing is used incorrectly or like consistently. Or for example, during the meeting, you'll see teams using terms spacing small or spacing medium, not using 16 pixels or 20 pixels. So, and once you have all those positive outcomes, I think then you're ready to expand your tokens to more.
I love that approach as well. It's always good to get feedback, especially with something that can be really new to your product teams. All right. So we did ask a question around where tokens are defined, and most people said they were defining them in the design tools, and they were allowed to select multiple options. So um, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you've defined tokens and what's worked well, and if you do anything differently based on your experience. And Patrick, I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, sure thing, Michelle. So for defining tokens, the way we've approached it, apart from coming out with the naming convention to Adenuke's point, where you want to make sure how you're naming things actually makes sense to your team and is semantically familiar. So we want to ensure that we have all these stakeholders. We want to make sure we're talking the same language. At the end of the day, that's what design systems, at least to me, are about, is to make sure people are communicating the same way: designers, developers, product owners, and so on. So once we're able to define what our token naming systems are, we normally have that as a guideline in Zero Height, where people can familiarize themselves with the system that we've used on naming our tokens. But now when it comes to the actual tokens, when it comes to consuming it, we have them in Figma, Figma variables, Figma styles, following the same naming convention. When we're doing our handoffs to developers, I'm happy to say that initially we were using an Excel sheet, and it's pretty funny because I remember talking to Nefertiti almost a year ago, and talking about how we're going to start going from our Excel sheets of managing tokens to JSON in the Bitbucket. And I'm happy to say we're practically at the finish line of managing all of our tokens in a JSON format, and now stored in Bitbucket. So now developers are able to automatically know when there is a change. They can just make a pull request or just fetch from that Bitbucket. So there's less of that miscommunication that could take place, and you have a clear understanding of what has changed because the tool shows you before and after. So we use JSON as a way of managing our tokens when it comes to actually getting it into the product that our users will interact with. And as a design system that handles across platform, there are some challenges because different platforms need to have different kind of file types to be able to implement, and that's something that we're still learning and working closely with our Nebula dedicated developers with on defining that.
Yeah, I love I feel like a lot of design system teams often start out in a spreadsheet of some sort, and it's great to hear you've evolved past that. I've seen some really interesting spreadsheets and very complicated ones. And Adekunle, I'd love to hear your experience about how you've defined tokens in the past and what's worked well, and if you do anything differently based on what you've learned from your experiences.
Yeah, for sure. I have to admit, I never managed tokens from a Excel document, and that kind of sounds like a nightmare. So kudos to anyone that actually does that. I actually done it multiple ways. So I in my last role at Plaid, we kind of had it where all of our tokens were defined at in Figma, and then we have like use the Figma API to kind of generate the tokens into like JSON format so that we can kind of use it on the code side. And then my time at MailChimp, we had it where all of our tokens were designed were built in from a tool using style dictionary, which allows us to kind of create our tokens and have it in different kinds of formats. So if you want to have in CSS variables and we want to kind of have it in Sass or Android, all that stuff, it kind of done that for you. And I would say like depending on, it depends a lot about like the people and the process. So at Plaid, again, Plaid was mostly like a API driven company and whatnot. So it made sense for design to kind of control that, and we didn't have that many like front end engineers and whatnot. So it just made sense for us to kind of like own a lot of that, the naming conventions and the outputs and whatnot. In Mailchimp, it was slightly different because we had a lot of front engineers, and we kind of built a system where like if marketing wants to create their own systems, they can do that themselves and whatnot. So I think it definitely depends on like the people and the process and whatnot. I think for me, I think from the design tooling perspective, it could be sometimes a bottleneck because I think there were some cases where one team wanted to kind of create their own and they kind of had to have like Figma licenses, and we didn't have that many licenses and whatnot, so they need to kind of use that and whatnot. So I think if you want to have more control and making a way where the design system team is like owning a lot of that work, then it makes sense to have it in the actual like design tool like Figma or any other one. If you're looking to be in the case where it's like, all right, we provide you with like the base level tokens, whatnot, but like other teams are like, oh, I want to have like a different color scheme and all that kind of stuff, then it makes sense to use like a coded version like Style Dictionary because it's like very flexible, and also like if you need support like different formats, whatnot, it kind of handles that out the box. So those are kind of the methods I use. And again, for me, if I was like starting from scratch, whatnot, I probably just lean on the code side until there was like a need to kind of have it in the design tool. Because I think one of the issues you can definitely have is like linking different um, linking different tokens to like referencing tokens to others. And it's very easy to do that from the code side. And I think it sometimes can be challenging for especially engineers to kind of be able to participate or kind of use any like design tools, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. And I think like the token space is still, even though tokens have been around for a while, like the tools and to support tokens and make workflows more smoother are still like in development. Like there's still a big open space that we're still trying to navigate. Um, but hopefully in years to come it will be easier for sure. All right. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the challenges that teams have with design tokens. So we asked what were the main challenges from our survey respondents, and the biggest one was defining tokens. And we did touch on that a little bit, as well as the ease of use across tools and integrating them into code. So I would love to hear a little bit more about everyone's approach to defining tokens, and who's involved when you've defined tokens. Kat, do you have any thoughts?
Sure. So yeah, defining tokens, who involved? I think Patrick and myself we are involved. No, I'm just kidding. Like I think we're thinking about let's say we started from colors. We're thinking about naming convention, and then we share with the team if that makes sense for them. Then we share with developers and asking them if that naming convention also makes sense for them. So I think this is the way how we approaching that so far. About tools and the ease of use, I think, of course, the ideal scenario will be to have one source of truth, one centralized documentation for tokens. But it's difficult. It's almost impossible, right? Because we designers define tokens in Figma, in design tool. We have to somehow hand it off to developers and they store it in a different tool. We have to have documentation of usage in a third tool. So I think the goal is here is not having the one tool, but make it in sync and as automated as possible. It is difficult, but it's possible, I think. So now we our process look like we define it in Figma using Figma variables, and then we using plugin to export it in JSON. We store it in Bitbucket for developers, and we also JSON file use for zero height. So basically, and this is pretty easy workflow. It's still not completely like totally automated. We have to do some manual work, but I think it's moving in a direction.
Yeah, that's really, really great to hear. And I know that is a challenge to kind of make it pretty seamless. And Ada Kunle, how have you approached defining tokens, and who's been involved when you've worked on this?
Yeah, so I'm a big believer in like collaboration early and often. So um always in case when we're defining tokens, I feel like it makes sense to have both like the designer and engineers in the same room. Um I've experienced in the past where it's like one like a certain naming convention means differently between design and engineer. Like even when we call something a component, it means different things and whatnot. So I think it's always important to kind of like define that like early in the process to kind of figure out like, all right, what is the naming convention we want to have, like how we want to do it. And I think it always starts with that why. And I think like once we get that why out the way, it's like, all right, this is why we want to do it. Like then we have to think about like the actual like how and whatnot. And I think early on, definitely it's going to be the case where once you're kind of settled in that, you have the designers, they'll like define that in Figma using Figma variables. And then from the engineering standpoint, depending on what you're supporting and like what the product is, you might have some sort of like using like CSS variables and whatever like that. And I think that's the biggest thing, like kind of like what Kat said, where it's like it's hard to kind of keep them in sync. And I think for me, like it's always the case where it's like you want to do it the hard way first because like you'll figure out like, all right, how can we make this like more automated and whatnot. And I think a lot of times is like you want to, it just depends on like the team and how it's structured. But once you kind of have that why, I think everything else like will fall in line and whatnot. And then I think from there it's just kind of like optimizing the process overall. So yeah, definitely it's like the biggest challenge I've faced was just kind of like keeping things in sync because there was like one situation where we were referencing some sort of like semantic token and the colors were totally different between design and engineering. And that was problematic because we were like, they're doing QA and they're like, yeah, this is different. Why is it different? And it was like because the tokens were not updated. So I always say like if you want to do it in a way where it's more manual, like anytime like a design a token is updated in Figma, I had it where a actual designer will go into like the code base to make that same update. Because I think it's always easier to do it like right away versus like having to like talk to an engineer and then having to do a pull request, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Those are really good points. And Patrick, I was really curious from your perspective as an engineer turned designer, how was defining tokens for you? Was this something that was pretty easy to grasp, or do you feel like you were a good, I don't know, dev whisperer when it came to defining tokens since you had an engineering background?
I love that. Yeah, definitely the dev whisperer. It was within ADT. It was a lot. I don't want to say easier because it wasn't easy, but it was a lot straightforward. Like I knew what the outcome needed to be. It was just a matter of just trying to get there and being patient enough to get there, and resolving challenges that came about. What what helped me a lot with my development experience in the past, and also previous experience of developing design tokens in other organizations, it's just that confidence of knowing what the outcome you want and the milestones you want to set for yourself and your team. Because at the end of the day, this design token should help to facilitate the design of the product being developed for users to consume. And how could we do that efficiently as team members? Like what's needed for us to make it automated? And now that we have a certain solid foundation that we can now proceed to explore how can we now automate this process, and then from there, trying to enhance it. The goals that we want to reach are very clearly set, but some of the challenges that I would say I faced have been, we started our design tokens from it. Some of it are really already existed, which is a good and a bad thing. We had like a decent foundation. However, that foundation wasn't scalable. And so you're wanting to be able to make changes, but not interrupt what's already happening and not break anything. So it was really challenging to figure out what changes can we make. We can't go, we can't just fully send it. We want to do all this awesome stuff, but at what cost? So being able to reel it in and make some compensations and some compromises was the challenging part, because you want to make sure the compromise you're making isn't going to affect your ultimate goal, of really getting it to being automated or being able to scale and handle different themes and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, so I think my development experience has really helped me understand the outcome we want to reach, and being able to know the paths we need to go to, and when to pivot, when not to pivot, and all that good stuff.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I think you bring up a good point about being patient with a lot of this, and not, necessarily jumping into things too fast. It's so, based on what Kat said of like starting with something small but getting feedback on that, is also a really helpful approach. I think, yeah, I guess I'd love to hear, what I guess at what point do you think is a good signal for expanding and moving to the next step of adding more tokens, or incorporating or automation? Adekunle or Kat, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I have. I have a strict process, like idea that like you shouldn't add new tokens until like you shouldn't add new tokens until you start feeling the pain. Um, because I've been part of a lot of design system teams where we were premature, like we would just like create tokens for feature cases, whatnot. And I think the problem is what happens is like you get to a point where the tokens get convoluted and people like start questioning when to use one token over another and whatnot. So I'm a big believer where it's like, all right, like you want to have this, new token, whatnot. Maybe it's like scope to like a particular product or flow for that time being, and then other, you know, teams start using the same token, and that will kind of say like that's the process of like, oh, that's you want to graduate that token into like the whole like the actual like token library and whatnot. Um, I would say like the challenge is that like you need to have a good process for that, and there has to be clear communication and collaboration between like the design system team and product teams and whatnot. But I think if done well, it'll make it in a pace where it's like making sure like it's very slow process and we're kind of thinking about it and not overreacting to like, oh, we need this in this particular flow, let's add it to the system. The idea is like you want to kind of make sure that like there's a use case for it, and then once we understand the use case and purpose, then we graduate to the tokens, and we know that like, what this is the naming of it based on the usage, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. That's a really, yeah, I like that approach. And Kat, did you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I wanted to add that I think educational part is also playing a main role here, um, to explain the value of tokens so to everybody, because it's you create all those layers of tokens, global aliases, components tokens, and what's the point if no one will use them because they don't understand like why they exist and how. So I think like educate them why we made certain decisions, why we created like 3 levels of tokens, and how to use them. So it's also very important before uh, before you expand your tokens.
Yeah, that is a really good point. Like education, I think, is something that people don't always think about for a lot of things when it comes to design system in terms of adoption and stuff. So that is a very good point. And I just want to remind the audience that if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, because we can start asking questions in a little bit. But I had one more question before you jump to audience questions. So there are several ways teams can document their tokens. And I'd love to hear more about how you've documented design tokens and what are some things that teams can do to make documentation helpful for the people consuming the design system. Patrick, would you like to share?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, like most stuff, it starts with knowing who your audience are. Are your tokens meant for designers, developers, and product owners, or what have you? But if I was to, let's just take developers, for instance, the way we would document it, of course, is the most important thing is the handoff. So that's where it's the JSON. So there's the question of, well, how might they be able to translate the base JSON file that we're delivering to their specific platform? And that's where something like style dictionary would come in place, or whatever process works from them. So the way we currently are documenting that is just in the README file of the Bitbucket. But we also have we started to do design decks, so which is just kind of like a PowerPoint of an overview of pretty much whatever initiative that we're doing. So we'll have a design deck for the specific tokens and how to use it, pretty much is what the deck is for. So with the developers in mind, the idea is that if there's a new developer wanting to use Nebula tokens, the idea is that they can take this design deck and clearly know how to actually take advantage of this. Where's the repo? How do you do this? How do you do that? Why is this token named this? All this good stuff. And links to resources such as the guidelines we have. We have guidelines for all of our current tokens, like why they are the way they are. Like our shadow tokens, we have our shadow tokens actually have like meaning behind the elevation, and we detail why we're calling this like level 1, level 2, so on and so forth. Or why is this shadow called container and this one's called like action? And we'll let the person know that the reasons for these namings is based off of that. And so I would say we lean heavily on those 3 resources, for particularly for developers, for the guidelines, for learning more about the naming convention and the meaning behind it, and then for the design deck for like a onboarding how to from start to finish to start to use the tokens, and then the Bitbucket README for just a cursory overview of where these tokens are and why it's like that, and what are some tools that you may want to look into implementing in your process to translating it for your specific platform.
Gotcha. I love the variety of ways to educate and inform your users. And Ada Kunle, do you have anything to add based on your experience? How have you documented design tokens? And what are some things teams can do to make their documentation helpful?
Yeah, so I kind of agree with Patrick, is like understanding users. So one thing I've done in the past is like done a lot of like user research for like the design system users to kind of really understand um, what they're working on, but also like how they use the system and like what are some of the pain points like during like that handshake process, whatnot. And I think what I found out is like a lot of like, especially for the engineers, is like they don't want to do like unnecessary work. Like literally, they just want to like copy and paste something. So even um, when we were like, all right, like how do you want to like document it? It was kind of a case where it's like, all right, from the developer, from the designer standpoint, they just kind of want to see like all the colors and see all the values. And from the developer standpoint, they want to see like, all right, where should I be using these particular like tokens and whatnot, and making sure that they can copy it, or you do in a way where it's like it's built into like their tools. So like I think there was like one design system team that had it where it's like they use like VS Code and they had like the tokens kind of built in. So it's kind of like IntelliSense. So they were able to kind of like showcase the actual token and also give a description about it. And I think that's the biggest thing, is where it's like you want to basically have a documentation like site or something like that, but also like making sure it works within the tool itself. Um, and I think and then the last thing I want to make is like you want to make sure it's like searchable. Because I think especially if you have like a large token set, and I think I've seen places where they have like 1,000 tokens, and I was like, wow, that's a lot of tokens. Like, how is anyone going to like parse it? But if you have like a good way to search it, like find it by like particular keywords, it'll make things easier and whatnot. So yeah, I think that's kind of like I would say, and also like providing guidelines and really educate like folks on like the the naming convention, because I feel like that's probably the most important thing, to kind of make sure that like, it's predictable and scalable. Especially when if other teams want to create their own tokens, you kind of like want to make sure that there's a certain structure and process in place. And I think from there, it'll make things easier as you kind of move forward in building, new products and dealing with color schemes and whatnot.
Yeah, for sure. Those are really great points. And I think search is super valuable because yeah, I've seen some design systems with like a list of hundreds of tokens and yeah, how do you how do you navigate that? We do have one really interesting question from the audience from Lurie. So they say, do you have dark mode support? Was it a challenge to identify elevation and surface tokens? If so, how did you define and solve it? And how did you document it and guide it and provide guidelines to the product teams? Would anyone like to take a shot at that?
I, yeah, I could. Yeah, I could take on the dark mode. Yes, we support dark mode, and I think it's with tokens. It's pretty easy to translate it to the dark mode. So previously we used like I would say in the design tool in Figma we used light and dark, just prefix before tokens before the naming. And right now we're using Figma variables where it's very easy to use them to apply them. So I think it wasn't challenging for us to define a dark mode. I think that's why you use tokens too. It's not only to translate them easily to dark mode, but to a lot of themes. So you have one name and then it's easy to translate by adding just one word of name of the theme and that's it.
Yeah, for sure. Ada Kunle, do you have any thoughts? Have you supported dark mode before? And how have you managed like identifying elevation and surface tokens?
Yeah, I have. In It was probably one of the more challenging projects I've worked on because even it was like not set up in the best case. So like from the developer standpoint, they were using a lot of their base tokens within the code base, and that was like a problem because um, based on like the context, it will kind of have to change. And we had some cases where like the light and dark mode was at 1-to-1, so we basically had to like map it out to kind of say like, all right, where does like the divergence happen? And that's why I'm like a big advocate of like using the alias tokens, because um, we were communicating that like the dark mode is like built in already, but then there was cases where like elevation where from light and dark mode it just didn't look good at all. So we had to use more, and they were like based on components. So we had to use like component specific tokens to be able to kind of alleviate that and whatnot. So that was kind of the one of the bigger challenges. But I think if you do it in a way where you document it and you tell people that like you shouldn't use base tokens, you should use alias, it'll make their lives easier and whatnot. And um, another thing that also happened was like a lot of we didn't have a lot of like adoption support for our design system, and one of the ways was like kind of use like a Trojan horse approach where it's like, oh, if you want dark mode and our components are built with dark mode, then you could just use our components. And that was kind of a way to kind of like drive into adoption, because people are like, yeah, I'm not trying to do extra work, so yeah, let me use those components and whatnot. So
Yeah, that's a really great way to get that adoption for sure. And we are at the end of the webinar, but I wanted to wrap up with one final question. So kind of touching on adoption. It's always a really hot topic for design systems. Teams are always wondering, how can I get my design system better adopted? So when it comes to educating teams for consuming design tokens, you all mentioned a couple ways already, but is there anything else that you would recommend, or is there anything else you would want to try differently based on the type of team of its designers or developers? Yeah, Patrick, Kat, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah. So the question is more so advice in terms of handling adoption.
Yeah, with design tokens, in addition to some of the other things that you've already done, is there anything else you would want to try differently? Or, any other recommendations that you have that you might want to try later on?
Yeah. I think that the point earlier that was made about like the Trojan horse approach, I think design system designers, we often have to lean on something like that, where it's just a spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down, where sometimes it's hard to communicate the overall impact and value of what's being introduced, because changes is a tough sell, especially if it's working. It's hard to persuade people to understand, well, why would I want to do it differently than how I've been always doing? I've been just getting by. Um, and really, it's the same thing with any kind of persuasion. It comes down to trust and rapport and being able to, we're designers. One things that makes us great designers, because uh, we can tap into our empathy very well, and you want to be able to tap into that, lean into that. Don't think of it as I need to get this across the finish line. Just think of it like, well, what's this other teammate or other department? What are their pain points, and why are they running into that? And is there a way that what I'm doing can actually help them alleviate their pain points? And then I think that will influence what direction you decide to go down, and understand what that timeline might be, because that's very important. A lot of times I mean, Kat and I, it's been more than a year for us revamping our tokens to be able to scale, and we're still not completely there yet, but you can kind of see how long it can actually take, and the patience again, and being able to communicate expectations, not only yours, but the other individuals that are relying on you, being able to temper those expectations. So I think with the adoptions, for me, I think I would have, if I could probably do anything different, probably do a little bit more communication in terms of uh, communicating like all the historical decisions made in a more definitive manner, like whether it's just like a document. We have like, we use Jira for tickets and tracking all this kind of stuff. So stuff like that, and then making more cadences where we're just reviewing like, hey, this is what we talked about, this is where we're at now. So I think a lot that might have made a lot of the acceptance a lot easier, and this also gives other champions some ammo to share with other stakeholders that you can't actually reach. So I think being able to documentation is so important for adaptation, and being able to properly roadmap and plan. I think it's just so vital. It'll go a long way, not only for yourself, but to help your other champions advocate for your design system within the organization.
Yeah, that's really great. Lots of really good takeaways there. And Kat, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, as Patrick said, written documentation is crucial to document all our steps, but also verbal communication. It's also very important. For example, we tried workshops with designers when we introduced spacing tokens. It was kind of task completion workshop in Figma, so designers can just jump there, and we had prepared some tasks, how to use spacing from our library, and they just starting to do that. So I think those it was fun at first, and then I think it's very helpful to just communicate verbally, not just, okay, here's documentation and you can go through that.
Yeah, for sure. And Ada Kunle, to send us home, what are your thoughts around educating, and if you'd like to try anything different, or do you recommend anything to other people?
Yeah, so I would say like think of like the design system as a product. Um, and I would say that because I've one of my biggest failures with the design system where it was like, spending 6 months building something and then we're like, all right, it's ready. Like we thought everyone's gonna love it, and then everyone was like, this is like the worst thing ever. And that taught me a valuable lesson where it's like, um, does like building a design system or like tokens or whatever like that, that's kind of like half the battle. And I think there's this like service there's like the second half is like the service where it's like you have to like basically be a salesperson and go out there like shake hands, kiss babies, and like, hey, like we have the design system, like we have these tokens, like what's your thoughts, what we could do better and whatnot. And I felt that's like the best approach, especially like with education. I've done it where uh we did like an embedding model where it's like, because again, when you live in like work in systems in tokens, you're like, you have deadlines but you don't really have deadlines. But like when you work in a product, and I've done it where it was like, all right, we need to get all this done in like 3 days, and I was like, oh god. And it was kind of a lot of work, and that helped build empathy for our users because we're like, all right, so they have like a million things happening right now. What is what are some ways we can make it easy for them? So obviously, like Kat and Patrick said, where it's like documentation, make sure it's like things are clear and concise, making sure the documentation is scannable. Because I think I've had multiple occasions where people are like, well, I don't know how to use this, but it was in the documentation, but the documentation looked like a encyclopedia page, and it was like, so it's kind of a case where it's like, all right, less words, more visuals and whatnot, and definitely doing the case where um, uh, have a cadence of like doing like research and whatnot, because again, people have different ways of learning, and I've been in cases where someone was like, yeah, I like content that's like from I like to like learn from like videos, or like to learn with like someone literally being there and kind of like working with me. So you just have to figure out like what works best for your audience. And I would say like you have to kind of be a salesperson and basically be a like mini dev designer advocate within your company, because I feel like once the system and things are in place, the next part is just kind of like getting buy-in and just kind of meeting people there and understanding their workflows. And I feel like that will kind of produce champions of the system and make things like work so much better.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like design systems, it's definitely more than just the building blocks that we use to build products, but there is a lot of you know, championing and people skills and communication. But yeah, thank you so much. We are at time, and it was great hearing everyone's thoughts. And thank you so much, Etta Kunle, Patrick, and Kat.